For today, we're talking about volt frequency scalability on our 8086K one last time. This time, coverage includes manual binning of our cores, as we already illustrated limitations of the IMC in our overclocking livestream. The major takeaway with these binned CPUs is that they can sustain a lower voltage and therefore lower power and thermals at a given frequency. But there's a bit more to it than that. Before that, this video is brought to you by Dollar Shave Club's Daily Essentials Starter Set. This full grooming kit ships at $5 and includes trial-sized versions of the company's popular shave butter, body wash, and wipes, and also includes a solid, high-quality razor and a full set of cartridges. Go to dollarshaveclub.com/gamersnexus to get the Daily Essentials Starter Kit for just $5 and with free shipping, or click the link below. So quick overview here. We already have a stream recap. If you're interested in that, go check it out, or check it out when it goes live in a day or so after this. We also have a video talking about the thermals, the power, and the noise considerations of the 8086K. What we're doing now is looking specifically at the volt frequency binning. So at what voltage is a frequency stable, or at what voltage is a frequency incapable of being held stable for whatever the benchmark is. So the two applications we're using today are just Blender and Firestrike. And the thing with these applications is Blender does AVX workloads. So it is somewhat comparable to Prime 95, a really popular stress testing program, except with Prime 95 you can adjust the FFT size. Now with smaller FFT sizes like 8x8, it's extremely abusive on the core and is great for finding a points of failure in an overclock. But you could also just do the most intensive application you're likely to use in daily use. And that might be something more like Blender, which is still intensive, still AVX, but it's not nearly as stressful for the CPU as 8K FFTs in a Prime 95. And ultimately, if you're trying to really make sure it's never going to crash, yes, Prime 95 is a great way to do that. Let it run for a while, see what happens. But what we're doing is keeping it realistic today. So Blender and Firestrike are good. Firestrike does not require nearly the voltage for stability that something like Blender or Prime require, because it's more of a gaming application. It's a synthetic game functionally. So Firestrike serves as a great stand-in for what kind of voltage we require at a given frequency for the 8086K when gaming. What we're also going to be doing finally is looking at just some rough scalability at stock, at a 50x multiplier, 51, 52, and 53, and then also we have a 5.35 gigahertz clock that we achieved in the stream. So that'll give us just a guideline for how much performance you can expect for each of those multipliers when overclocking something like a high-end Intel CPU. So last note here before getting into this, keep in mind that the voltage requirement to keep a given application stable changes based upon the application and what kind of workload it creates on the CPU. Also keep in mind that this voltage, if it goes higher to sustain a frequency in an application, is going to require more power and it's going to output more heat. Refer to our previous 8086K video for that. It's a great study on how the processor thermal and heat load behaves and how it can impact your noise levels to a factor of 2x when you are dealing with those higher voltages to sustain higher frequencies. And eventually you want to meet a middle ground where you get a decent volt frequency table without being too abusive on the CPU or on your noise levels. So we'll start with Blender today. This is a great example for just binning the volt frequency in an application that actually is something we can use. So it's not like Prime in that way. Keep things simple. For Blender, all of these, our requirement is stable for 30 minutes. For the most part, if an overclock is going to fail, it will fail in that 30-minute window, almost always. Now, if we were selling these CPUs like a company like Silicon Lottery does, we'd want to run it for a whole lot longer than that, probably on an order of hours. But for realism's sake, in terms of completing these tests, we chose 30 minutes because we know 99% of the time, if it doesn't fail in that window, it won't fail. So keep that in mind. Either way, starting with Blender, we found that in Blender, 5.1 gigahertz at 1.35 volts was stable, whereas as you'll see in the Firestrike table in a minute, we were able to hold 5.1 gigahertz with a slightly lower voltage, depending on what we were working with for parameters. We have a couple of other Blender numbers here for volt frequency requirements, and you can see where we finally stabilized and stopped for this one. Firestrike is where we spent the most time though, so let's move on to just Firestrike right away. For Firestrike, this is a lot less intensive than AVX workloads like Blender or Prime, but more important for competitive benchmarking purposes. And Firestrike, most impressively, we were able to sustain 5.0 gigahertz at 1.30 volts, which was sustainable during our live overclocking stream as well. We later verified a stable, prolonged period of Firestrike physics testing with the same configuration, so it did survive for 30 minutes, and this is functionally a stand-in for gaming. It illustrates just how well binned the 8700K CPU performs, and that's ultimately what an 8086 is. Our 8086K holds 5.0 at 1.30 to 1.35, depending, for Firestrike, whereas the 8700Ks hold 5.0 gigahertz at 1.40 to 1.45, in this case depending on which CPU it is. That's the bigger takeaway here. At a given clock, we've reduced our voltage requirement significantly. 5.1 gigahertz also held at 1.30, but only for long enough to run the 30-second test. It did not survive the longer burn-in. We next found a 53x multiplier to be stable at about 1.39 volts, which is impressive when considering most 8700Ks could never reach 5.3 gigahertz, even with high-end cooling. You need exotic cooling for that. That's even more true now, though, because most of those higher-end 8700Ks would now be removed to become 8086Ks. We were unable to stabilize a 54 multiplier under any circumstances, including per-core overclocking. We were, however, able to sustain a 101 BCLK, shown in the leftmost column, with a 53x multiplier and 1.41 volts. This gave us a 5350 MHz core clock at 1.41 volts. Pretty impressive. For purposes of Firestrike physics, it would appear that the optimal performance to thermal and power configuration would be roughly 5.1 gigahertz at 1.32 to 1.35 volts with our specific CPU. And as always, this will change based upon the individual CPUs. None of them are made equal. You'll also see an LLC column here in our notes. The Asus Maximus X board seems to keep a fairly flat voltage provision for V-Core when at LLC level 6, which is what we want. Going to LLC level 7 was sometimes necessary, but it tended to over-provide voltage when spurious delivery became problematic. So you'd end up jumping in voltage in a way that could be damaging if you're using your CPU under a 24/7 overclock with a voltage you think is lower than is reality. Moving on finally to scores. For relative scores and scaling, we found the following results across our 8086K frequency testing. Firestrike spat out an 18,007 score for the complete baseline test. That's stock with only XMP enabled. Clocking trivially to 5.0 gigahertz and 1.30 volts got us to 20,900 points, an increase of 16% with about 30 seconds of work from a 700 megahertz or so bump in the clock. We next observed only a 1 to 2% increase in score by overclocking an additional 100 megahertz up to 5.1 gigahertz. Our 5.2 gigahertz overclock at 1.35 volts yielded an increase to 21,773 points, an increase of 21% over the baseline of 18,000 from earlier. At 5.3 gigahertz and 1.4 volts, we observed an increase to 21,992 points, hitting diminishing returns now, another marginal hike over the previous hike to 5.2 gigahertz. Each 100 megahertz increase is, at this point, hitting diminishing returns, and we're not individually gaining a lot, but it's still measurable and it's repeatable. By jumping to a BCLK of 101, which increased the memory frequency and also impacts other things in the system, we ended up at 23,223 points. A big jump, but a lot of that is from the BCLK increase and therefore the frequency increase and just general responsiveness in the system. Going to BCLK 101 with 3600 megahertz memory at CL15, so now we've improved a lot of things at once, including an uncore of 51 to 52, we had a final result of 23,745 points. So going back to the discussion then, our CPU binned out to basically have definitely stable 52 multiplier for the uncore, which is great. We haven't tried higher yet. We are definitely stable at 5350 megahertz for the core. And then for the rest of this, scaling, once you get into the 5 gigahertz range, beyond that, there's not a huge impact for Firestrike physics. And that will correlate actually better than most games will. I mean, if you compare Firestrike physics to games, the correlation is semi-linear to a point. And the point at which it stops being linear is when you start adding more cores, because Firestrike is a lot more responsive to more cores and threads than most games actually are. But because the core count on the 8700 and 8086 remains somewhat reasonable for a game to use, the scaling is fairly comparable. And from that, we can draw a rough conclusion, and we'll look into this more later if we need to, but it's an 8700K all over again, so same idea. Draw a rough conclusion that at 5.0 gigahertz, if you can keep your voltage and therefore power and therefore thermal is way lower, it might be worth just running at that, in which case you could buy an 8700K, roll the dice, and hope that it's a 5 gigahertz chip. And a lot of them are, but the ones that are 4.9, you're still not losing a ton. Going up to 5.3 is fun. It's good in terms of having something to do and telling all your friends you got the best one. But in terms of performance, unless you're competitive about it, like Firestrike overclocking competitively or something like that, you're not going to gain a ton of extra frame rate out of another 100 megahertz or 200 megahertz or whatever it is. But when you're talking 400, 500, 700, like we're doing here in some cases, that's where it definitely becomes noticeable. This, of course, also reduces render times in applications like Blender, but not to the same extreme that increasing the thread count would do, because it is a more thread-intensive application in that instance. So that's it for our 8086K bin. That's what we ended up with. That's how our CPU performed. We actually just got another one in that we paid for another purpose, a build that we'll be talking about in about a week or so, hopefully. So stay tuned for that. Subscribe for that content and other content as always. We've been working hard on getting back to a bunch of charts and data because it's been a little while without all of the launches and with Computex and travel in the way. So getting back into it, had a lot of charts for this week's filming. I hope you enjoyed it. And you can support us on patreon.com/gamersnexus. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to pick up this freshly restocked teal teardown logo shirt. If you want to pick that up, this one's been in high demand since we put it out about a year ago. So grab it there. And otherwise, subscribe for more. I'll see you all next time.